Welcome, my name is Danielle Beach Oswald, and I'm presenting a series, and this is one on asylum and humanitarian law. I've been practicing law since 1992, and during that time I've had occasion to do cases all over the country, and this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. Today, there's over 40 million immigrants in this country. Back in the time of Abraham Lincoln, there was only 4 million. Yet, the proportion of immigrants to U.S. citizens, native-born, is about the same. We've heard a lot about immigration in the law lately, in the news, immigration reform, a much-needed proposal that we will see what will happen, and another series will be put out on video about that. But today we're talking about particularly humanitarian issue of asylum. Asylum can be affirmative or defensive. Affirmative asylum must be filed within 1 year of the time that you enter this country. If you don't file within 1 year, it can lead to problems such as not being eligible for asylum, but only being eligible for a lesser relief called withholding of removal. Withholding of removal will not ever lead to a green card. So that is the problem. However, it does give you relief and allow you to work and remain in the U.S. The second problem with withholding of removal is it does not allow you to bring in your spouse or your children, which asylum does. If you're granted asylum, you can bring in your wife and your children, providing that you file within a 2-year period after the time you're granted. After 2 years, you cannot. So the idea is to file as quickly as possible once you enter the country, but not just file a story and your asylum application, because that will never win your case. You need to prepare adequately so that when you go to the interview, you can win your case. Because if you don't win, what happens is that you would be referred to the court. And if you have to present your case before the court, then that is called a defensive filing. It has advantages because it allows you to put on witnesses that will also testify on your behalf. It allows your lawyer to present your case in more detail and a much longer period of time of 3 hours as opposed to maybe only 1 hour or 2. And it allows you to say more things that need to be said about your case and to present documents and witnesses on your behalf. In immigration court and at the asylum office, it's very vital to document your case very thoroughly. That is the key to winning the whole case, is documentation. How do you get put into immigration court proceedings? Well, there's 2 ways. One way we just talked about is if your affirmative application is denied. The second way is if you're arrested at the border and you came in on a false passport or document, and then the Customs and Border Patrol people refer you to the immigration, who will then have a credible fear hearing to determine whether or not you're eligible for to go before the judge. Once you go before the judge, then you get a chance to present your full case. During this process, it is essential to remember that what you're looking for is persecution that occurs on the grounds, specific grounds, which are race, religion, nationality, particular social group, and also political activities. Those 5 bases the relationship must be established, and there must be a nexus to one of those 5 grounds in order to gain asylum. So for example, if you were persecuted not by the government, but by another group, and you were harassed and not actually ever arrested or harmed, that would probably not be asylum. You can also remember is that for asylum, if your country conditions change, and for example, a dictator is put into power that was not a member of the party that you belonged to previously, then you can prove also asylum not only based on past persecution, but also on well-founded fear of future persecution, which would be the grounds of your activities here in the United States. This is particularly seen in situations like Syria, where suddenly there is a revolution and suddenly people who are here, maybe on student visas, are in danger if they go back home. So, in addition to this, you want to look at 2 factors. subjective and objective. Subjective involves whether or not you're afraid to go back, and that has to be proven. Objective involves what are the country conditions in your home country? Does your country condition reports and the State Department reports about your country say that your country is a country that does the kinds of things that you say in your story happen to you? There must be direct or circumstantial evidence to show that the persecutor's motive is based on one of the 5 grounds which we just listed: race, religion, particular social group, nationality, or political activities. For that relationship to be established, I'd like to suggest 3 points that you can do that if you explore these thoroughly, they will help you win your case. One is profile, one is probability, and one is particularity. So let me explain what I mean by that. Profile is who are you? What is your education? What is your employment background? What is your role in the community? If you're a leader of those particular things, or if you are just a farmer, or if you are an activist, all these things make a huge difference. So you want to have a profile of who you are, because that will be determinative of how your story should be developed. Second thing, probability. Probability are the country conditions. Is it probable that a person in your situation would be persecuted? There are many, many reports, Amnesty International, Human Rights, State Department reports. All these reports are looked at by the Immigration Service, by the judges, and are presented by you to either the Asylum Office or to the Immigration Court. The immigration position would then be, which we call ICE if it's in the court, and if it's at the Asylum Office, it would be an asylum officer, would be determining whether you're credible compared to those country conditions. The third point I just mentioned is particularity. This is very important, and of course is very rarely specifically examined by people who file their own asylums. A good lawyer will ask you these kinds of questions and develop this aspect. This is, what are your ties to the community here at home? What do you do here in the U.S.? Do you have a specialized career? Do you have people here in the United States who are brothers or sisters or other family members who have gained asylum? Do you come from a country who has had female genital mutilation? All these things involve particularity. And all these things are detailed factors that must be examined when looking at an asylum case. If you gain asylum, it is a huge benefit because within 1 year, you can apply for a green card. You can also work. You can also travel and get a travel document, a refugee travel document, which is a passport that you can go anywhere in the world except your home country. Now, the problem is with asylum, you cannot go back to your home country really until you become a U.S. citizen. Because if you do, that can cause problems later on and could prevent you possibly even getting asylum, your green card or naturalization, and it could also lead to you being put back into removal proceedings depending on why you went back and how long you went back for. So these are all things that are very important. You also eligible for certain public benefits for a period of about 8 months. As I mentioned earlier, you can bring in family members. What if your child is over 21? I get asked this question all the time. Well, if your child is over 21, the question is, when did you file that asylum application? If you file that asylum application before your child turned 21, then under the Child Status Protection Act, you would indeed be able to bring over your child. You can also bring in a spouse. But again, both your spouse and your children, you must file for them before the 2-year period from the time of your grant. Now, there are certain things that can affect you getting asylum. What are those things? Well, for example, if you have ever been determined to be part of a group that was part of a terrorist group, if you assisted in that group, or you're even a member of that group, sometimes is enough. And we call this the trig bar. which people often don't have a problem with, and they're granted asylum, and then they go to apply for their green cards or their naturalization, and they're told that their case is put on hold. The reason their case is put on hold is because they've been determined to in some way be associated with a possible terrorist organization. Another thing that can prevent you from getting asylum is if you have committed a crime. Now, if this crime is a danger to the U.S. or is a particularly serious crime, which you need to talk to a lawyer to determine if you have any convictions as to how this crime will affect your asylum application, because it's certainly most likely any crime will affect, and depending on the seriousness of the crime, it could affect your whole asylum application and bar you from asylum. That being said, what if you don't get asylum? Well, your next option, best option, is to get withholding of removal. Withholding of removal, as I mentioned earlier, is not as good a relief. It applies to people who either the judge will say in their discretion they don't want to grant asylum because they feel this person did something negative. They lied on their visa. They lied when they came into the country. They came in on a false passport. And other things that could be considered by the judge to go to their discretion. Withholding of removal can only be granted by a judge. It cannot be granted by the asylum office. So at the asylum office, only asylum can be granted. The other thing is that withholding, again, does not allow you to bring in your wife or your children. It does not allow you to get a green card. These are very important things to consider. The most important thing that I would say is that also withholding of removal has a much higher standard. Instead of a possibility of persecution, you have to prove a clear probability that it's more likely than not. So your burden of proof is much higher and you get much less. So it is the most important thing in all of everything I've said is that asylum is a very complex area of law. It's a very changing area of law. There's constantly new law coming out, constantly new cases that change things. So you want to be careful that when you file for asylum, you always consult a lawyer. In particular, anybody who has lived in another country before coming from their home country can have a special problem called firm resettlement or safe haven. That is very important because usually, if you file asylum and you've been living as a student in Germany or Holland or somewhere else for several years, or you have been traveling to other countries and you have not applied for asylum until you came to the U.S., the asylum office will usually deny you and send you to a judge. Now, I've had very good experience doing these kind of cases because if you look at all the factors and you examine this, with experience, you know how to handle these cases and whether or not the person should even file asylum, or maybe they're eligible for something else. And in that case, you want to consider that. Worst come to worst, if you can't get asylum and you can't get withholding, perhaps you're eligible for what's called the Convention Against Torture. That was established in 1994 by Congress that implemented this legislation. It prohibits returning people who meet its requirements. What is looked at is the nature of your harm. The level, again, is even higher than the withholding. The level is severe physical or mental pain, and it must be done by with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or person acting in an official capacity. The advantage of torture convention is if you have a crime and the crime is too serious for asylum, or you have waited too long to file for asylum, then, or that you weren't persecuted because of a political or religious or race or nationality or particular social group ground, then torture convention may be another option because you don't have to establish the nexus requirement. So these are all factors to consider. And if you're going to file for asylum, don't make the mistake of filing at the asylum and just thinking that it's writing a story, because that would be a huge mistake. You have to have all your documents ready, lots and lots of documents. That's what wins the case. and good preparation, because any mistakes you make in your asylum application, when it gets referred to the court, all those mistakes will come up again. And it's sometimes very, very difficult to correct them. I get a lot of those cases where people have filed their own or they used another lawyer, and that there's so many mistakes, and you try to fix them, and it makes the case much more complicated. So find a good lawyer to do your asylum. Spend the money that you need to so that you and your family can live here for the rest of your lives happily and successfully without years and years of being in deportation proceedings. And you will be much happier as a result of having done that. Thank you, and I hope to talk to you again shortly about other immigration topics that we have in mind for you to help you to make your life here a success.